Okay, before we get this video started, this is all gonna be one take. This is take number 70 or whatever. I don't know. I'm losing my mind, okay? I mispronounce things all the time, and unless I do this, this video is not gonna be done. Okay, so let's Hello. I just came off a 3-day long binge watch of archaeological content on YouTube, and it is no secret that I am deeply fascinated by archaeology, anthropology, and history. I love that stuff. And whenever I end one of those binges, I always want to talk about something that I did a few years back that is related to those fields. And that thing that I did is that I made a Minecraft server, and in that Minecraft server, somehow cultures developed while the players were playing. Well, I shouldn't frame it like that. You shouldn't think of those cultures that formed as like a new language was born and a new kind of people was born only in that server. No, that's not what happened. But while the players were playing, slowly but surely, certain flourishes that could be attributed to culture did rise. And that is fascinating, and that is what I want to talk to you about today. So, the players developed culture. How similar was the process to real life is the first question we should be asking. The answer is not at all. But it had some similarities which were surprising. Well, why wasn't it that similar to real life? For me, I'd say the reasons are two. And the first reason is that, first of all, these are not real people in the game. They are players. And since they are players, they don't really have the same motives and incentives as real people. So it's not gonna work the same way. It doesn't mean, however, that it's not gonna work in a similar way, which we're gonna see. Also, every single player that played is a modern human with modern sensibilities and modern culture, and everything they do is, what's the word I'm looking for? Informed by that modern culture. So, wouldn't those two reasons make any culture that appears superficial? Well, for me, the answer is both yes and no. Cultures on the server were largely superficial, which means that the reason people did things isn't exactly because they needed to do them or they felt they need to do them, but more because they were role-playing or because they wanted to. For example, somebody wanted to do the Soviet Union somehow, all alone, so he named himself Stalin or whatever, and he started ruling over an empty piece of land. I wouldn't call that culture exactly. So if that isn't culture, what is culture? What do I classify as culture in that game? Well, I personally would classify culture as the behaviors and the, what should I call them? The different characteristics that a little society in that server would take out of necessity, or those behaviors were born out of natural reasons, natural organic reasons. So, for example, again, if a player went and proclaimed themselves as king and everybody started to be ruled under them for roleplay reasons, I wouldn't call that culture. But when a group of players comes together and a leader naturally forms, and a small structure to that society forms, then I would call that culture actually, because it is happening organically and naturally, and that actually did happen, which is fascinating. Oh my god, fascinating. So, how was culture expressed on the server? Well, how is culture expressed in real life? Well, you would say art and music and architecture and all of that stuff, all of that good stuff. Unfortunately, that's not really happening on a Minecraft server. Nobody's composing any songs on a Minecraft server, nobody's painting any walls on a Minecraft server, and the architecture is more utilitarian. Either utilitarian or they are copying something out of the modern world, usually. So, what could we use to observe culture? Well, something that the server has, which the material record and archaeology unfortunately do not have, is conversations. Conversations and relationships. Relationships, there we go. Those two are things that were pretty common in the server because it's a server. People talk, and the way people talk and what they talk about is very informative, very interesting. And it did lead to the creation of certain ideas, which ideas slowly but surely matured, evolved, and led to full-blown cultures. So, to what extent did cultures develop? And that is a real interesting question. And if I had to give a real life analog for the height of the cultures of the server, I would say they reached the maturity and complexity of a Stone Age or Neolithic, whatever you want to call it, settlement. No real empires, unfortunately. There wasn't a society that was more than 40 players because 40 players was the height of the height of the server's popularity. No, the height of the server's player base. That's the right word. Oh my god. So, unfortunately, the way this works is that from a purely utilitarian purpose, whenever a group becomes bigger and bigger, the more complex and the more robust the organizational system needs to be. And this also works in reverse. If the group is small enough, then you do not need such a complex organizational structure, which means that since the biggest society the server has seen is like 40 people, you won't really find the depth and complexity of a real society, a society of like 500 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people. You will not find that here. And this is one of the biggest factors that makes the cultures of the server diverge. Thank you. And this is one of the biggest factors that makes the cultures of the server diverge from real life cultures. Because the cultures of the server are very minimalist, they're very small, they're very close knit, they're very tight. But at the same time, they're kinda not in a strange way because in real life there are families and there are tribes and there are extended families or whatever things that connect people. Well, in the game there is no such thing, and since there is no such thing, there are other things that make players come together. One of them being necessity. Necessity in the way that it's better to have 5 people to fight rather than 3. So there was a tendency to come together. But again, it was in a weird way and also not really at the beginning. It's whatever. Let's get to the history actually, so you understand. So, some information about the server, because the interesting thing is that the server's cultures, s- um, a lot of their little cultural things, their flourishes, they came from a utilitarian angle. And things that are useful to the players slowly became meaningful to the players. And meaningful things for the players are things that are spread and also things that are retained. And those are what forms the culture. So a few parameters I had for the server is that first of all it was running not a regular build of Minecraft, it was running a modified build of Minecraft with mods. Uh, some of these mods added temperature to the game, which could kill you, and it was dependent on the biome you lived in. Uh, Also, the map was the map of the Earth. Classic, I know, but it was for a reason, and that reason was so that I could see the migrations and see how people would settle places and see if that coincided with real life, which it kinda did and kinda didn't. It's weird again. Also, food was pretty scarce on the server, and growing it or hunting or finding food in any sort of capacity was slow, complicated, and difficult. So, this made for a pretty brutal world, a pretty difficult to survive in world. So I made the server difficult to survive in the hopes that it would bring people together, and it did. So let's take a look at that. Uh, at the beginning of the server, the the server's population began at where's what's it called? Modern day Tunis? I think it's called Tunis. That was the world spawn. That was the spawn. And spawn was a very, very, very crucial part of any society of the server. Because spawn, first of all, was the spawn. This is where people spawned in. So if you wanted to get more people or you wanted to uh, trade with more people or you wanted to stay away from people, you would be very, very interested in spawn. This created honestly a pretty interesting effect, and that effect, coupled with the fact that teleportation wasn't a thing in the server, if you wanted to go somewhere, you had to walk, and the map was pretty big, so it would take 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to go anywhere. It was pretty big. The effect that this had on the server is that it created a little world, let's call it a little bubble. In that bubble is a network of societies because people wanted to trade with Spawn because Spawn had trades, and because people like trading with other people, everybody settled around Spawn. And going further away than that designated area around Spawn would mean that you are pretty much alone because travel would be very long. And also, something else that I had on the server was proximity chat. If you wanted to talk to people, you had to be close by to them. If you were away from people, you couldn't talk to them. The game was silent, and proximity chats range was at about 50 blocks, which is 50 meters. There was a need for community, so people huddled around spawn. So the beginning. I'm gonna organize the service history into periods because A, that's cool. B, it lets me roleplay as a real archaeologist. And C, there actually were big enough differences for there to create a need for further classification, let's say. The server's culture actually evolved and changed so much that it makes it viable to break down the server's history into periods. And this is the first period, which I'm gonna call the nomadic period. In the nomadic period, settlements were not really a thing. What people would do is they would spawn, they would pick a direction, and they would travel. And while traveling, they didn't have a concrete place to settle in mind. The idea of settling somewhere was a real thing. People wanted to settle, but the way the server worked, it made it kind of difficult. Because first of all, you had to, before settling, you had to, what's it called? Establish yourself, establish your economy. You needed to have provisions, because without provisions, you couldn't travel. That is something that the server actually had. You had to save up in order to travel, because if you see to the south of the spawn is the Sahara Desert, and the Sahara Desert in game was very dangerous, very hot, and devoid of animals and plants for you to survive. So the way people liked to travel was by water, which is very interesting because that is actually how people prefer to travel in real life as well, through water. Water makes it faster, water makes it easier to navigate, especially if you're following some kind of coastline. And also, places close by to water are usually not that extreme, they're temperate. And also, there's drinking water in water. I forgot to mention, the players had to drink water. So, the early landscape of the server was dominated by nomads who would constantly move around. They, depending on the season, because the server also had seasons, they would sometimes visit the desert, or they would sometimes visit places far away in order to grab exotic materials, or in order to go where it's more temperate, where it's warmer or colder, so they don't die. I forgot what I was talking about. Oh man. Yeah, they would travel all the time, which makes this period very turbulent. Turbulent. There we go. It will make this era turbulent. This turbulence would in turn not exactly destroy, but disrupt any attempts at making a permanent settlement. Raiding was very common. Griefing was very common, which griefing is destroying somebody's structures and buildings for no reason other than to do it. And people, in order to stay safe, did not make big structures, did not make big towns, they did not coalesce together. They traveled and they made little hideouts in order to store their resources. And this is honestly what dominates this period. And if I had to characterize this period with a period in real life, I would say maybe the Middle Stone Age, maybe the Early Stone Age. People were nomads, people were hunter-gatherers. There was no reason to settle down and stay somewhere permanently. People were organized into little tribes, and when I say little tribes, I mean groups of 2 to 3 players, maybe even solitary players. And those tribes would do some rudimentary kind of trade, but not really. They would make some rudimentary settlements, but those would not be permanent, and they would make rudimentary war. But it's not war in the way we understand it right now, in the way we understand it in the modern age, because for there to be war, there needs to be some sort of political entity. War is not just fighting, it's more like an accord between countries, if that makes sense. Which is why there are rules for war in antiquity and in the ancient times. Sometimes they would organize certain battlefields and they would meet there. War is a lot more organized than what was happening in the server, right? In that age. What was happening was raiding. A lot of raiding took place. And all of that constant raiding and all of that constant movement made it so no place had a permanent population. It was, how can I characterize this? It's really interesting. Places do not have the significance or the history or anything really that we ascribe to them in real life, in the modern times, or in the ancient times for that matter. Places were just places. There were no borders, there were no distinctions. The only distinction was the biome. So whenever somebody wanted to travel, they wouldn't say that I am going to the Sahara. They would say that I'm going to the desert south of Spawn, and anywhere in that desert south of Spawn was fair game. It didn't matter where exactly they were. There was no West and East Sahara. There was no point for that distinction. Same goes for bigger regions. For example, Europe. Europe right now as we see it, the countries in Europe are usually pretty smaller than countries in, let's say, North Africa. And that is because the places have a lot of distinctions and a lot of history to them. That wasn't a thing in the server. Europe was one thing. There was Europe. There were different climates in Europe, different climates enough to make it worthwhile to at least break it down into North and South Europe, but anything else, there was no point. And speaking of Europe, and speaking of places, how far did our humans travel? Well, in this era, not far at all, to be honest. The farthest people traveled was Central Africa, Southern Europe, and maybe the Western Middle East? Maybe. I'm not sure. There was really no point in traveling somewhere really far away, due to the reasons I talked about a few minutes ago. Those reasons being the little bubble of habitation and of human interaction that had formed. There was really no incentive to go further. There was no point. So what is the culture of this era? Well, I would say that culture hadn't formed yet. Culture as an idea, as something that exists, wasn't a thing. First of all, there was no reason. Players were not trying to form cultures, and that is true for the future as well. The future eras, they still weren't trying to form cultures. It just happened on its own. There was really no reason to create groups. The only groups that existed were the little player groups that traveled, but they wouldn't really try to differentiate one from the other. They just saw it as, hey, there's some more players over there. That's it. There wasn't, oh, this guy is from this place, or this guy has this and that characteristic, so it makes them different from us. No. Everybody saw everyone else as just players, which, by the way, is not really true for the future, which is very interesting, and this is what I'm gonna go into right now. The second era, which I'm gonna call the era of the proto-cities. Proto means first, if you didn't know. The first cities, and I shouldn't really call it cities, I should say the first city. The first city. After a little bit of time, things calmed down. And because things calmed down, people slowly started picking out places to settle. And those settlements are what created the idea of the land gaining characteristics in the eyes of the players. What I said before, where a location doesn't really matter except for its biome, well, now that's not really true, because certain locations had certain settlements, and people who were settling, they did not enjoy being constantly raided, so settlements are slowly beginning to get organized. They're slowly beginning to get militias. They're slowly beginning to erect walls and defenses and fortifications. And those defenses and fortifications are what made them able to dominate a location. And this is what creates the network of settlements, which would be a thing until the end of the server. This is the beginning of civilization, right here. And the beginning of civilization also brought with it the beginning of the lands taking different attributes. For example, a very poignant example is the Southern Mediterranean, because the Southern Mediterranean was a highway. It was a highway because most of the players who would travel would follow that coastline, which was very close to spawn, and because they followed that coastline, most settlements would actually be settled in North Africa, close to the Mediterranean, and that meant that a lot of activity was going on at the Northern Mediterranean, to the point where people would take notice of that, and they would create hideouts and set up ambushes in order to catch people off guard and what's it called? Mug them. There were muggings. And not only there were muggings, the location, the area, the Northern Mediterranean actually got the reputation for those muggings. So slowly people started moving away from it. And that is honestly really, really cool. Because the location itself now has history, and that history not only came up organically and naturally, it also is something that was useful to the players. It was useful for you to know the hotspots for player activity, because you could trade better, or you could you could trade better, or you could try to avoid those places, because those places would sometimes spell trouble for you. And these small settlements, which those small settlements are basically those 2 to 3 player groups settling a place. Groups did not grow yet, they will. And those settlements are the first ever structures that are visible. And not only are they visible, so they're not a hole in the wall or a hideout in the mountains. They are a house, a hut, a fortress. They are meant to gather the attention of other players. So instead of hiding from each other, the players slowly started wanting to interact. So why would they want to interact? The reason is technology. So at the beginning, at the first era, the era of nomads, there weren't any weapons per se. The server itself had a mod which added guns, and those guns were expensive and complicated to make, and the ammunition for them was also expensive and complicated to make. So nomads usually carried around with them a sword or an axe and attacked each other in that manner. Settlements, however, were formed so they could mine the surrounding area and extract all of the resources. Also so that they could slowly start growing food, and they actually made farms, and this is the beginning of agriculture. And yes, that really sounds like the Neolithic, which it kind of is, I would say, the early Neolithic. So those complicated weapons made it useful for players to trade. They had to trade because not everybody had access to the ores in order to make guns. Not everybody had access to guns in general. Not everybody had access to certain food items. Not everybody had access to ammunition. So the people who started to produce more than they needed would start to trade. And that trade would slowly but surely create a network all over North Africa. This is the first network, an actual network, that was created. It wasn't just a small bubble where all of player activity took place, because player activity actually began to expand. We see expansions in southern Europe. We see expansions in the Atlantic portion of Africa. We see expansions and settlements in Central Africa. We see expansions into the Middle East. We see a lot more exploring, because people would be able to make food that would last them for quite a while. And those what's the word I'm looking for? Those surpluses, there we go, in food would make it possible for players to travel and set up and colonize places further and further away than the known world, let's call it, which is very interesting. And something else that is fascinating is the fact that now settlements are beginning to become places of power. In what way? Nomads still existed in this era, of course, and they would continue to exist in every other era alongside the settlements. They never went away. And what nomads cannot do is extract resources efficiently or extract a lot of resources, so usually they wouldn't be able to make their own guns, their own ammunition, their own high-tier food. So what they did was they either joined up with a settlement that had those, or they traded for those things. And that first thing, joining up the settlement, meant that now society started to form. It wasn't 2 to 3 players anymore. It was slowly rising. It was 4 players, 5 players, 6, 7 players, and players that were complete strangers. They would meet up, and for the purpose of survival and getting resources, they would partner up with other players in those settlements. And one settlement in particular in Morocco was created. It was dubbed Carthage. It was at the end of the highway, and at its height it sported 7 players. It had complicated machinery, big farms, a castle under construction, and a rudimentary societal hierarchy where there was a chief. There was a chief player, and that chief player would divvy up tasks for the other players for them to specialize in. And that is something very interesting that happened as well. Specialization. In the previous era, there was no such thing, of course. Everybody just hunted and gathered. Everybody fought. Everybody produced. But now there were players that were better at some things and other players that were better at some other things. So slowly there became dedicated builders, there came dedicated fighters, dedicated gatherers, and this structure would slowly give Carthage the power it needed in order to dominate pretty much the entirety of North Africa. Of course, there were adversaries, but when I say dominated, I don't mean control per se. When I say dominated, I mean everybody knew Carthage if you were in North Africa. If you had settled in North Africa, or you were active in North Africa, or you came from North Africa, or you moved into North Africa, you knew Carthage. Carthage was important to you. Carthage was important to you because they could produce what you couldn't way better than you. So if you needed guns, if you needed food, if you needed anything, you would go and trade with Carthage. Either that, or you would trade with towns that knew Carthage and they also traded with Carthage. And Carthage would sometimes mobilize and completely erase a settlement if they perceived that settlement as a threat to them, or that settlement wronged them in any way, but they wouldn't really try to conquer anything. There wasn't a concept of a state or a nation. There was no point. There was only cities, free cities and settlements, and each settlement had its own area, and each settlement had its own way of doing things. And those ways of doing things began as pretty similar, but slowly they diverged, slowly but surely. Carthage would go on to dominate North Africa for quite a while, and this era would be characterized by Carthage's dominance, which is why the end of this era is characterized by the fall of Carthage, because Carthage fell. And Carthage fell because new players and new, not settlements, it wasn't a settlement that destroyed Carthage, it was nomadic people. Nomadic people, I wouldn't say moved, the activity in the north of Africa, the activity in the southern Mediterranean picked up a lot. And because the activity picked up, raiding picked up, and that had a very bad effect on the civilizations that had Northern Africa as their center. Carthage was devastated, and it wasn't devastated in a single attack, although it did sustain devastating raids. Slowly but surely, the communication and the trade routes and the prosperity of the settlements of Northern Africa was destroyed, and it was destroyed due to this period, this period of instability, period of conquerors, period of raiders, because the settlements made themselves way too rich, and they were so rich that it became a good idea to siege them, even if there were a lot of players, because if you won, you would get so many riches, and that is what happened. A few successful raids on Carthage devastated it. The player count of Carthage went down, the production of Carthage went down, the castle was left unfinished, and it was left unfinished forever, and the Carthaginians moved back into their hideout, into underground bases. They stopped producing food by farming, they went back to animal husbandry, and that made their exports way worse. They couldn't manage to mine because the area was devastated and constantly in risk of rain. So the production stopped, and also the trading stopped, and all of them together led to the fall of Carthage. And Carthage falling wasn't just Carthage falling, if that makes sense. Carthage falling was emblematic of a collapse of the network that had been created over on northern Africa, and collapses happened a lot on the server, and this wouldn't be the last time a collapse happened. But whenever we say the word collapse, and this is a very interesting thing that the server also showed, whenever there was a collapse, we tend to think of it like, let's say, the Middle Ages, that the people went back, they became savages again, the barbarians took over, things became much more simple and much more rudimentary for a while, and they had to work their way back up to old and lost glories. That is not true at all. At all. The thing that fell is the network itself. Everything that the players learned remained. Everything that the players picked up remained. The history of the land remained, and North Africa would remain a hub for pirates forever, basically. From that point onward, North Africa was an area of desolation, and people would not return here to settle. But they did take the network and everything that they learned from the network into consideration, and they would use that to create new networks and new settlements. And every time they did, they slowly but surely created more things, and they slowly but surely started differentiating one from the other. For example, at the end of the proto-cities period, it was actually useful for you to introduce yourself and say where you're from. Before, there was no point. There was no point in saying where you're from, because there wasn't really a concept of belonging. Nobody belonged anywhere, but people did belong to settlements. So settlements and the areas that took the names from the settlements would actually become signifiers. And whenever you met up with a new group of players, you would say, hello, I am from this and that place, and they would actually identify you as somebody from that place, because they knew that place, and they knew what that place was like, how warlike or how peaceful it was, and those attributes of that settlement, they would then project onto you. You had an identity back then. So if you said that I am from Carthage, then people would associate that with glory. They would associate that with the biggest town in the server. They would associate that with riches. They would associate that with you being skilled. And in the later period, they would associate that with the fall of Carthage, and that you came from an area of instability and a lot of fighting. So at the beginning, people who were from Carthage, they had an identity of opulence, an identity of being important, because if you got on the good side of a citizen of Carthage, then maybe you could strike up a deal. Maybe they would trade with you with more favorable terms. Maybe they would help you out in a fight, in a raid. And it became useful for players to try to count out them. And later, whenever somebody said, I'm from Carthage, they would understand, other players would understand that this player is probably a good fighter. because there was a lot of fighting going on in Carthage. So in a completely natural and organic way, identity was born, and identity that was tied to the place that you associated yourself with was born, which we could call ethnic identity today, but I would prefer to call it I don't know, tribal identity. I would say civilizational identity, because the land itself still didn't have that much meaning. The settlement on the land had. So the settlement that you came from had a lot of significance. Okay. The thing with Carthage, and something that will change in the future, is that while Carthage did dominate the north of Africa, it did not dominate the entire world. Carthage was powerful because of its location. Carthage was powerful because it was so close to spawn. Carthage was powerful because it was the biggest settlement in the known world for that point. So if you were in sub-Saharan Africa, you didn't really care about Carthage, because it wasn't a utility to you to be connected with Carthage. You didn't care. And you didn't care because the travel to get to Carthage meant that you had to go through the Sahara, which wasn't really a thing yet. They were able to do it, they could do it, they didn't need to. They didn't care. Same for Europe. Europe didn't care about Carthage or the Middle East. Alright, so some more cultural flourishes, some more things that happened. I don't have a script as well, so I have to really think about whatever happened and remember. I could talk about war. I'm gonna talk about war. Or more specifically raiding. In the previous era, in the era of the proto-cities, raiding was basically mugging. It was you and another guy, or you, a friend, and a small group of guys that were after you, and either you defeated them and took their stuff, or they defeated you and took your stuff, and that was about it. But in the era of the settlements, the proto-cities, raiding took a more serious connotation, because if somebody raided a settlement, they would not leave it standing usually. And that wasn't really for utility that much, it was more because players who wanted to raid wanted to burn down settlements. They liked it. They liked to destroy settlements completely. So for a settlement, being attacked was an existential threat, something that the nomads did not really have to worry about. So this is where the fighters of a settlement are slowly starting to organize. They're getting better gear. They're doing drills. They're trying to improve their aim. They're trying to fight better. They're trying to coordinate with each other. They are creating fortifications, and fortifications that they use in order to repel attackers. And while the concept of an army wasn't a thing, there was a concept of the militia. The militia was the fighting group of the settlement, and usually that contained every single person in the settlement, every single player. There wasn't really a reason for somebody to not fight, and people needed all of the manpower they could get their hands on. So whenever a settlement was attacked, everybody would man the walls and they would fight back. And this is where we start to see the first really large altercations. For example, the sieges of Carthage. Carthage did not have walls. It didn't. It tried to build a castle, but it failed because it tried to create the castle too late. What Carthage did was, at the beginning, it settled in a place that while was dangerous, wasn't really that dangerous due to the activity. Piracy and raiding hadn't picked up yet, so it was all just structures meant for storage or habitation or production. There wasn't really walls or fortifications, and whenever they had to fight another settlement, they would attack, and they didn't really have to fight against nomads, because nomads would leave Carthage alone, because Carthage was 7 people and they were one guy, the nomads, or 2 guys. However, in the later periods, nomads would start to coalesce. Nomads would start to interact with each other and coordinate attacks on settlements, and they would also share the spoils of war. So this is what happened to Carthage. Carthage was attacked by a conglomeration of many nomads, and while it wasn't a great numerical advantage for the nomads, because I think they were 6, 7 at most, they were enough to pose a threat to Carthage without having to siege it, because if Carthage sends a trader with stuff on them, they would intercept them. Or if Carthage tried to farm and expand, they would attack, and whenever the militia showed up, they would vanish. They would constantly harass the settlement, making it difficult for the settlement to operate, which in turn led to the settlement shrinking, which made it possible to siege it. And the settlement of Carthage did not really have fortifications until the first sieges, where they started making a castle, but they weren't fast enough in making it. They collapsed before they were able to erect any fortifications. And with the collapse of Carthage, the era of the proto-cities ends. And with the era of the proto-cities, the worldview of the server up to that point would change, because the worldview of the server, as far as you were concerned, as a denizen of the server, North Africa was everything. North Africa was the center of the world, and every other place you could think of it as irrelevant pieces of land smooshed to the edges. The only maps and the only map you would need to make was of the network of North Africa. You didn't really need to care about Europe or sub-Saharan Africa, even though there were still networks there, even if they were much smaller. But that would change. After the fall of Carthage, we are going into what I would like to call the imperial era. I call it the imperial era because it's the first time the server would see an empire rise, which does sound very exciting, huh? So how did that empire rise, and which empire was it? Where was that empire? The answer is that after Carthage fell, the people of Carthage fled, and some of them found refuge in the rest of the now destroyed network of North Africa, although slowly but surely, due to the raids, everybody pretty much would leave North Africa. The network would be completely destroyed, not just minimized. And what happened is that the network itself would move to Europe. The other members of Carthage that did not try to go to the rest of North Africa sailed across to Spain, then all the way around to Portugal, then to France, and then to Ireland. And there in Ireland, they settled. And that settlement in Ireland slowly but surely grew to encompass 20 players, which was unheard of the time, because in the previous eras, 20 players was the entirety of the server. 20 players was pretty much everybody. Now there exists a settlement big enough to completely overshadow the previous eras of the server. And that settlement actually was so powerful and so important for the server that the center of the world moved. It became more important for you to care about Europe rather than North Africa, and North Africa had spawn in it. Actually, Ireland became more important than the spawn of the server, which was completely bonkers, honestly. It was crazy. For the first time, I had actually seen a settlement that had enough gravity to overwrite the utilitarian reasons that the server itself provided to players. Because in the previous eras, you cared about North Africa because that's where people spawned. That's where people went. But now, Ireland and its pull was so strong that the entirety of the focus of the server moved to Europe. And settlements began popping up in Italy and Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But most of the people going to Europe would settle in Ireland. And Ireland, with its 20 players, became the biggest empire the server had ever seen, the first empire the server had ever seen, and the first settlement that could really be called an empire. Why is that? That is because Ireland would actually be so influential and so legendary that its eventual fall would once again characterize the next era. But it's on a different level than Carthage, because it does sound samey with Carthage. But the difference with Ireland is that if you went to any single player after Ireland had fallen and you said you were from Ireland, they would know Ireland. And they would know you because you were in Ireland. The entire server knew Ireland. Ireland was the center of the server, the center of the world. Everything began with Ireland, everything ended with Ireland. Ireland was actually so powerful that nomads and raiders that entered Northern Europe in order to raid in its lands would either be driven away from the sheer force of Ireland, or they would be subsumed into Ireland. And that made Europe completely safe. And by making Europe completely safe, it once again permitted the creation of a network akin to the one that was created in North Africa. But the network now can protect itself. The network now has checks and balances in place in order to protect itself. And that is why Ireland can be called an empire, because Ireland dominated the land. It had influence over the land. Settlements close by to Ireland would be subservient to Ireland. They weren't really, I wouldn't exactly call them completely autonomous settlements. They depended on Ireland. And not only would they depend on Ireland, Ireland would exert power over them as if they were a part of its political constituency? What's the word? Contingency? I don't know. They were part of its political sphere. There we go. And being part of the political sphere of Ireland makes Ireland the very first society in the server which exerted control over other societies. This is pretty much the first country. The first country that the server had ever seen. Right there. And that was fascinating. I was there because I was the owner of the server, so I was watching the entire thing unfold and I was blown away. it is really, really, really cool seeing all of that happen, because Ireland had complexity. Ireland had politics. Ireland had politics, which is also something crazy to say, because the chief now, proclaimed as emperor, would have other, not the chief. Let me rephrase it. There existed people in Ireland that had political power with the chief. There existed people in Ireland that also had political power along with the chief. Because in Carthage, it was only the chief. The chief gave orders, whatever the chief said, it was done. But Ireland was big enough for there to be subgroups. And those subgroups would be more loyal to their own leader rather than the emperor. And the emperor himself would have to keep the smaller leaders in check. So what slowly rose out of Ireland was a segmented society. There were the people, and then underneath the people there was their local leader, and no, not underneath, I'm sorry. Over the people was the local leader, and over the local leader was the emperor. And the local leader would also create identities for the people underneath Ireland. For the first time, in order to identify yourself, you wouldn't just say that you're from Ireland, because everybody was from Ireland at this point. Almost everybody, actually. You would say that you're from Ireland, and then you would say which settlement of Ireland you're in, or you would say which group of Ireland you're in, which was really, really cool. People would actually identify each other from the social caste, let's call it, where they are, their group. And there would be 3 levels, 3 actual castes, which was the regular people, the petty or small leaders, and the emperor. And there will also be groups that were parallel to each other. Those are the ones we can think of ethnic groups, because people would start to differentiate themselves under Ireland by the way they built their houses, by the way they built their settlements, by the way they fought, by the food they would eat and grow and cultivate, and also by other utilitarian structures which they would create. What does that mean? Well, in this era, in Ireland, we see the very first use of climate control. Because before, whenever the climate would get extreme, in the nomadic era, people would move. They would leave the area. And in the proto-cities era, they wouldn't live in a place that had extreme temperatures. That's not really true in Ireland. In Ireland, winter was enough to kill a player. So what they did was they created a climate control system for Ireland. In previous eras, if somebody was cold, they would light something on fire, or they would make a pit and pour lava into that pit and warm themselves that way. The city of Ireland, in Ireland, would actually have dedicated lava pits in every house to keep them in a comfortable temperature. They would have dedicated lava pits in their roads so that people could travel in winter. They would have dedicated lava pits in workplaces so people could keep working and doing stuff as the winter rages on. And that is something that was never seen before on the server. And something even more interesting that was never seen before on the server was those lava pits slowly began to be different, let's say. Because at first, everybody just had a hole in the floor with lava, which was dangerous for obvious reasons. People fell into those a lot. So what they did is they surrounded them with blocks. and that looked ugly. So because it looked ugly, every single place and every single group slowly began to create their own design, independent from each other. And towards the end of the period, you could actually identify which settlement somebody was from or which group somebody was from, depending on how they built their warming pits, which is completely bonkers. It's crazy. That is actual culture. We have culture now. We did it. And that is not the only thing that denoted culture. Identifiers also denoted culture. Certain ways of fighting and certain ideas about fighting denoted culture, because in the previous era, people were naturally split between raiders and settlers. And the settlers didn't really enjoy fighting, or I shouldn't say enjoy, because they played the game. They enjoyed fighting, but they wouldn't fight for no reason. You had to give them a reason to fight. Raiders would just fight. Raiders would fight with each other all the time. Raiders would fight with settlements all the time. They would keep their lifestyle of being nomads because they would fight all the time. Those nomads, some of them were subsumed into Ireland. So people who enjoyed fighting for fighting's sake were in Ireland, and they formed groups, because settlers and people who wanted to be given a reason didn't really see fighting for the sake of it as interesting. They thought that creating a society and settling and production and politics are more interesting, and the raiders, they didn't really care about all that stuff. The only thing they cared is being given food to eat and guns to shoot with. So they were two different ways of thinking. And those two different ways of thinking eventually evolved into ideologies, which I will go into in a bit. But for now, there was a rudimentary split between people who wanted to raid and people who didn't. And that would lead to political upheaval. Why? Because the raiders like to raid, but launching attacks for no reason under the name of the empire was bad for the empire, because the empire was seen as aggressive. And if the empire is seen as aggressive, then people will not be happy to see you, let's say. If you are going for a diplomatic mission, or you're going for a trade, or you're going to convince somebody to enter your network, they were not happy to see you. And being happy to see you was important for the network of Ireland, because Ireland had the strength to completely obliterate every single settlement on the server. They could take down anybody. It wasn't an issue of military. It wasn't an issue of power. The issue was that if they did that, then those people would leave and they would settle somewhere else. And that makes the network that Ireland created weaker. So diplomacy was really important for Ireland. So having people who just raided for no reason underneath the empire was seen as bad. So there was friction, and that friction eventually led to a schism. And that schism eventually led to the dissolution of Ireland, which would end the imperial era, the era of Ireland. Which is interesting because while interacting with Ireland, those raiders, they slowly began evolving their way of thinking. Some remained steadfast to the ways of raiding, and they would just put it off Ireland, and they would raid all over Ireland, or at least they would try to. Some raiders were actually open and understanding of the idea of peace, and all they would do is fight whenever they were called for it, which was an evolution of their ideology, let's say, of the way they thought. And that also happened with the settlers, because during the era of Carthage, there wasn't really an idea of raiding other settlements for their resources, because you already had resources. There was no point. You would be making an enemy, you would be damaging the network, you would be doing all of that for no gain, really. But in Ireland things changed, because the network of Ireland wasn't the only one, just like before with Carthage, but the difference is that the networks now knew of each other. They were aware of each other, and different networks had no reason to not raid each other, because they wouldn't lose anything. They weren't part of each other's network either way. So networks that were poorer than Ireland's would try to raid into Ireland, and Ireland would launch expeditions in order to stamp those networks out and get anything that they would have. Which is interesting, because that you could call these proto-countries. They really weren't in the traditional sense. There wasn't like a government or something, but there was a loose set of rules and something that connected them, and there were other networks that were not connected in that same way with them, which also created different identities as well, created different identifiers. So people would start caring if you were from Ireland's network or not, just to see if you were an enemy or not, which was also very fascinating. And places would sometimes switch networks, they would change, because they would find, opportunities to join other networks, or the network they were on would fall apart, or it would change in some way that made it not worth it for them to remain in it. That was my tongue, excuse me. So yeah, I think that's it for the Ireland era. We're not done, however. There's a lot more to say, because after Ireland and after its eventual fall, there was a new era, and how Ireland fell is very important for this new era, because this new era is what I'm gonna call the era of contraction, because the server at that point had gotten smaller. What happened was people were leaving the server faster than people were joining the server, so the server became smaller, and because the server became smaller, the structures that the server created within itself were no longer needed. You don't really need a network to trade with like two guys, let's say. That's not really something you need. You don't care. So the network slowly fell apart. Ireland slowly fell apart. Everything degenerated from natural causes. Everything except for culture, though, because even in the era of contraction, people still remembered the previous eras, and they took everything they learned and they applied it here as well. First things first, to get out of the way, yes, a lot of people from Ireland scattered, and they scattered all over Northern Europe. Europe remained the center of civilization. Europe remained the center of activity, and it actually became the server itself, slowly but surely, because other networks fell as well, and because they fell, The only network that really remained was Europe. There was no point to settling in Africa, for example. There was nobody there. There was no point to settling in Asia, for example. There was nobody left there. Everything happened in Europe. And the interesting thing with Europe is that it wasn't new people that formed the new societies. It was those very same Ireland denizens. So that makes the settlements that propped up after Ireland successor kingdoms. I wouldn't exactly call them kingdoms, but they are successor settlements. And the organizational complexity went down because those settlements would go back to being 4 and 5 people, or 2 and 3 people. The sophistication went down because you would no longer have that much manpower. You would no longer have the need for big structures and big climate control projects or whatever. However, they still remained, let's say, tight-knit with each other because they knew each other from Ireland. They knew who each other was and they knew their identifiers. So this is the first creation of settlements whose identity is not tied to the land, but they give the groups themselves, and the groups and the identifiers is what gives their land identity.
You understand? Hell no! What the fuck did you say?
They would settle a place, and that place would no longer be called Belgium, for example. It would be called I don't remember the name, but it would be the area where this group settled. What's the name again? I forget. Whatever, it's fine. Those little settlements and their identifiers, they created I wouldn't say tribes. They created sort of like a nation, because then if you migrated from one settlement to another, you would retain your identity, your national identity, or tribal identity, or ethnic identity, or whatever you want to call it. Your characteristic identity, let's say. You would keep that. And people in the same settlement as you would see you as a different identity. You work together in the same way that people work together in the proto-cities, but in the proto-cities they didn't see each other as something fundamentally different. In this era they did. Having the identity of raider, for example, would bar you from certain settlements. Certain settlements would be aggressive towards you just because they know you were a raider, even if you don't raid anymore specifically. And people would actually try to show that they changed if they wanted to join somewhere, for example. If a raider wanted to join a peaceful place, or if a guy who's not really known for their martial prowess tried to join a raider settlement, they would have to do something that signified some kind of change. Sometimes it would be attacking the settlement if they wanted to show that they are combat capable. Sometimes it would be stripping themselves of weapons and basically disarming themselves to get into a settlement, and they would not be allowed to have guns. And slowly but surely those different things that they did, those symbolic actions became more and more symbolic, let's say. They became more and more what's the word? God damn it. Give me a second. Okay, those things became slowly more and more abstract because you didn't need to provide something that had utility. You just had to provide something that convinced the other guys, and the other guys were convinced by history. So they would actually do some things which, if we look at them now, we would be kinda perplexed, because they carried some kind of meaning to them, like throwing your guns down, which was it would make sense, but it had significance for them, because you wouldn't exactly welcome somebody the moment he drops their gun, but those people would, because it would signify something. Same for gifts, or same for renouncing identity. Renouncing your identity was something that was not taken lightly, because those identities are things that people would identify you with. They were useful. So if you were to denounce that, it would show that you are denouncing the entire structure you were a part of in the past. And slowly but surely, these settlements, through mutual trade and through power struggles, they came together until they formed another empire. And that empire was based in Germany. The name of that empire is forgotten, because I have forgotten it. And that empire is interesting because not only was it big, it was the entire server big. And when I say the entire server, I mean literally everyone was part of that town. Every single person, every player, everyone. Which is interesting that it happened. And the creation of that empire is kinda the end point of the server, because after that empire fell, the server closed because people stopped playing. The empire took a lot of inspiration from Ireland, because people really liked Ireland and they liked the glory of Ireland and the significance of Ireland, and so they tried to make Ireland again, and they succeeded. And people lived in peace and harmony. And the issue is that that town in Germany that tried to emulate Ireland didn't have any political complexity. There was no leader. Everybody just kind of did their own thing, which led to an uprising, let's say. It led to a complete destruction from the inside. It led to a struggle, and the eventual destruction of that town led to the destruction of the server, because when every single player is on a single town, if that town falls, and usually when a town falls, players take a break or they stop playing, everybody took a break or stopped playing. So that was the end of the server. The good news, however, and actually give me a second to drink some water because my throat hurts. I've been talking for so long. There we go. The good news, however, is that the server wasn't dead exactly. Well, it was dead, but I remade it. And everything you heard about thus far has been Season 1. I called it Season 1, like it's a Netflix show. And everything that happens from this point onward is Season 2. And Season 2 was a lot more short-lived. Fewer players played. It never reached the popularity or the population of the old server. But again, the cultural complexity of the players never dropped. Actually, it only rose. It went up. And that is kind of baffling. It's also very interesting. And the reason this happened is because of the Discord server and because people talk. That's the thing with people, they talk. And for the 3 months that I was working on Season 2, people were talking. And they were talking about the server, Season 1. and why it fell. And slowly but surely, two camps emerged for the reason why the server fell. And I am sure that you will find those two viewpoints very familiar. One camp, which was the pacifists, said that the server fell because of constant raiding and because people left whenever their settlements and structures and hard work was raided and griefed and destroyed. The other camp, what should we call it? The raiders, let's say. I'm making it too easy, but whatever. The raiders believed that the server died because everybody coalesced into a single town and there was no war, so there was no reason to keep playing. And for the eagle-eyed of you out there, you will realize that these are exactly the offspring of the settlers and the raiders in ideology. And this became actual ideology, it became actual philosophy, it became a way of thinking, as funny as it sounds, because where you stood on that debate completely and 100% informed your actions, informed what you wanted out of the game, informed what you would do inside the game, and of course informed the culture that you were part of in the game. So when the server eventually was open, the people who were pacifists and the people who were raiders had reached a point where their ideologies were so alien to each other that they couldn't see eye to eye. They couldn't mesh. They were completely differentiated one from the other. There was never a settlement that had raiders and pacifists. It wasn't possible. In Season 2, there were settlements of pacifists, and there were settlements and raiding parties and nomadic groups of raiders. And this is what created the political landscape and the cultural landscape for Season 2. Alright, hold up. Let me pull up the map. So the thing with Season 2 is that the map is no longer Earth. The map is something I made myself. And the point of making a custom map is so that I could control the resources on the map. And what I did is, for every single possible ore, which included the normal Minecraft ores of diamond, coal, iron, gold, redstone, and the modded ores, which are aluminum, copper, sulfur, and some other things. I would make certain areas have very large concentrations of them and make other areas devoid of them, so that if you settled somewhere, you would have an overabundance of one ore and a need for 5 others. So of course this instantly created a server-wide network of trade. And the way the map is made, it really facilitates that, because you could island hop and follow a coastline to reach any single place on the server, and that's what people did. What people would do is they would travel to trade, and they would travel to find new places to raid. And season 2 can't really be split into eras, really, because there's one era, let's say, and that era is the era of 00. 00 is a town which was created. The town was smack dab in the middle of the map, in the middle of every single trade route and trade network, and dominated the entire server. Everybody traded with 00, everybody knew of 00, but it never reached the control and the power of Ireland. It never reached the population as well. It had 7 members like Carthage. It had 7 players like Carthage. I said that already. It had 7 So it couldn't really exert as much control as Ireland, although it was in a more culturally sophisticated world than Carthage. So what that entailed is that 00 had no real influence over other settlements. Other settlements knew of its existence just because they could trade. What 00 was a trade hub. And even after 00 fell, the town, 00 the settlement, and 00 inn, and 00 the trading hub, and a lot more settlements would prop up in that exact place to keep the same function as the town itself, as the settlement. What happened to the settlement? It was besieged, and it was besieged in the most organized and sophisticated way the server had ever seen, because the raiders really knew what they were doing after the 4 eras of season 1. And even though 00 had walls, and it had battlements, and it had towers, and it had dedicated guards, it still fell. And 00 is an interesting settlement, because due to the way season 2 worked and the world of season 2 worked, 00 was never able to grow in the same way that Ireland and Carthage were able to grow. The first thing that 00 had built was walls. The second thing was a tower, and that tower and those walls kept everybody in, because if you went outside you would die, because raiders would frequent the place constantly. 00 was under constant lockdown, under constant military rule, under constant it would actually be under a constant siege, pretty much. A constant siege. And the organization of 00 reflected that. There was a chief, and everybody else was basically a soldier. What they did was not for themselves, it was for the town. Everybody worked within the confines of the town, or if they went out to get resources, they would go as an expedition. The town would be on high alert at all times. Anytime somebody came to trade, guns would be pointed at them, because 00 was not having a good time. And honestly, that does kinda sound like the early Middle Ages, after Rome fell, in a very specific look at this castle kind of way, because 00 was a castle. It was a castle in the same way castles were built in the 10th and 11th century. It was a castle town pretty much, and because of that it was eventually sieged and obliterated, and when it fell, the other settlements kept trading, and because they needed a hub for trading, settlements would keep popping up on 00's grounds, and they would keep getting destroyed. So what that created, it was a very interesting what's it called? Let's say archaeological site, because when you looked at the ruins of 00, at some point you would be able to see 4 settlements worth of history at once. The first settlement was destroyed, and then the second was built upon the ruins of the first one, and it was also destroyed, and then a third one was built next to it, and it was also destroyed, and a fourth one was also built next to it, and it was also destroyed. And what is most interesting is that the giant walled armored farms that 00 had and 00 used to produce the first settlement, the farms that it used to produce and trade for, the raiders kept them. They didn't destroy them. They didn't actually damage them, because there was no point. So people tended to them independently. The second settlement took over, and then the third, and then the fourth, and the farm was kept operational. And between the time of settlements, anybody could just enter the farm and harvest and plant to their heart's content. And whenever a settlement dominated that island, it would operate the farm. And that farm was kept operational for quite a long time because that farm pretty much fed half the server, which is very interesting. Unfortunately, after a while, this server also died down, and that was pretty much the end of this geopol. Unfortunately, it wasn't the end. Unfortunately, for my mental health, it wasn't the end of geopol that I made. I have made other geopols. None of them were as sophisticated as this one. But for me, this server has and always will have a special place in my heart, and I have a fascination with it. Why? Because of everything that I talked about today. And let me check the recording, and that is 2 hours of me yapping away. Oh my god. And this is 2 hours of me yapping away, with me drawing blanks in the middle of it, with me having no script, with me being completely terrified to talk to a microphone, and messing things up all the time. So if I actually organize this, then maybe I could talk for 10 hours, 20 hours, I don't know. And maybe if I made another, I would be able to talk for 40 hours. But that's neither here nor there. For now, thank you so much for listening to my ramblings. I hope you found whatever I talked about today interesting, at the very least, and as fascinating and as eye-opening as for me. Because while it may not be scientific and it may not be that well coordinated, I do still kinda treat this server as experimental archaeology. I'm not gonna say I'm coming to any kind of scientific conclusions, no, but there are some very interesting things that came up from this server. And I think that if this server is done again, and it's done in a better way, better managed than the one I made, then maybe it will have the potential to become something truly special. Thank you again for your time, and I will be seeing you. Oh my god, my throat hurts.